Hello everyone. Now I would like to complete our lesson about the derivative of hyperbolic function. In the first video we talk about the derivative for hypersine x with respect to x. But if we have the derivative with respect to x for hypersine u is a differentiable function of x, then it will be hypercosine u but multiplied by u prime, or you can write it u prime multiplied by hypercosine u. Rule 2. The derivative with respect to x for hypercosine u, it is hypersine u multiplied by u prime. Number 3. The derivative with respect to x for hypertangent u, it is equal to, it will be hypersecant square u multiplied by u prime. Number 4, the derivative with respect to x for hypercotangent u, it is negative hypercosecant u multiplied by u prime. Number 5, the derivative with respect to x for hypersecant u, it is negative hypersecant u hypertangent u multiplied by u prime. Number 6, the last one, the derivative with respect to x for hypercosecant u, it is negative hypercosecant u hypercotangent u multiplied by u prime. These are the 6 rules for the derivative for the hyperbolic functions. And I have some identities for the hyperbolic functions. Then hyperbolic identities. Number 1, hypercosine x all squared minus hypersine all square x, it is equal to 1. Number 2, hypertangent square x plus hypersecant square x, it is equal to 1. Number 3, hypercotangent square x minus hypercosecant square x, it is equal to 1. Then we have 3 identities is equal to 1. Square of hypercosine x minus square of hypersine x, it is 1. Square of hypertangent x plus square of hypersecant x, it is equal to 1. Square of hypercotangent x minus hypercosecant x, it is equal to 1. We have another identities here. Number 4, hypersine square x, it is equal to negative 1 plus hypercosine 2x divided 2. And number 5, hypercosine square x, hypercosine square x is equal to 1 plus hypercosine double x divided 2. And number 6, hypersine 2x, it is equal to 2 hypersine x hypercosine x. Number 7, hypercosine, the double angles rules, hypercosine 2x, it is equal to hypercosine square x plus hypersine square x. These are the double rules. Okay, and we have some identities for the sum and the difference between two values. Hypersine x plus y, it is equal hypersine x hypercosine x plus y, plus hypercosine x hypersine y. This is number one. Number two, hypersine x minus y, it is equal to hypersine x hypercosine y minus hypercosine x hypersine y. Number three, hypercosine x plus y, it is equal to hypercosine x hypercosine y plus hypersine x hypersine y. Number four, hypercosine x minus y, it is equal to hypercosine x hypercosine y minus hypersine x hypersine y. I think it is nearest to the rules for the trigonometric identities, but we have a different signs between them. Okay, how to solve some questions about the derivative for the hyperbolic function. Example 1. Find d dx for hypersine 3x squared minus 1. Here, what is the derivative for hypersine? It is hypercosine for the same function, 3x squared minus 1, multiplied by the derivative for this function, it is 6x. Number 2, find the derivative for hypertangent 2x plus 3. Then what is the derivative for hypertangent? It is hypersecant square. It is hypersecant square 2x plus 3 multiplied by u prime, which is 2. Thank you for watching.